I'm hoping that my video is clear since Justice Chinengo had not seen. But good morning to you all. And I'm really privileged and honored and pleased to be chairing this session on behalf of the Africa Judges and Jurists Forum. The Africa Judges and Jurists Forum is an increasingly influential Pan-African network of eminent women and men judges, as well as jurists who are committed individually and collectively to promoting the rule of law and development in Africa. It is committed to working with the African Union member states to address the huge implementation gap that exists between progressive regional and international instruments that the AU member states have voluntarily adopted, and the practices that are experienced in such states affecting the ability of Africa to unlock a sustainable development agenda for the people of Africa. It accomplishes this goal by providing legal expertise to governments, to intergovernmental organizations, to donor agencies, private sector, as well as to civil society organizations. The Jurist Forum works to enhance access to justice, the rule of law, good governance, and economic growth through standard setting, justice sector and legal reform support, as well as rule of law related capacity enhancement initiatives for the effective realization of the benefits of democratization in Africa. So we are very pleased to be launching this study that was done looking at the state compliance with human rights standards in Southern Africa. All of us know that the advent of COVID really altered the way in which we have lived our lives. The panic and fear that came as a result of a novel virus that had no treatment, had no vaccine, and which was seen as capable of spreading so fast. It really sent a panic to virtually everyone. And as a result, as normally happens when there is little scientific knowledge and little knowledge about the disease itself, the tendency is for people to then look up to governments to be firm, to be strong, and to then treat the virus as an enemy that really needed to be fought hard using all means to protect people. And in that sense, it was not surprising that the main approach, given the way in which the virus spread, that is spread through human beings, the lockdown measures based on declarations of states of emergency or state of disasters, became the primary initial mode. And these were generally accepted by many people, and in the process, once there's a state of emergency and there's a state of declaration of national disaster, people accept when fundamental rights are suspended and when fundamental rights are undermined, and in the interests of the right to health. So the securitization of the response to the COVID pandemic also created problems that what Professor Thuli Madonsela said, that the characterization of people as the problem rather than COVID as the problem meant that security sector agencies targeted people. And before we noticed it, the disproportionate impact of the COVID pandemic began to be felt along the structural fault lines in our societies. So the poor, the vulnerable, those with less means became the ones who suffered most because of the incompatibility between lockdown measures and the need for survival, the pains of hunger, the need for water, the need for basic amenities. So as a result, being detained in houses for more than a day or two for vendors for people in the informal sector. That's a lot. And it simply meant that it was not possible. And as a result, they started walking the streets and becoming the target of the law enforcement agents. This is just one example. The right to education, we saw that many schools, the education system was crippled. I think it's still crippled in many countries. The right to life itself was threatened by the pandemic itself. Right now, as we speak, there are more than 200 million, 300,000 people who are infected. That's the total number of cases, with 4.2 million deaths that have been experienced. And here in Southern Africa, South Africa remains the epicenter in Southern Africa, but in Africa as well. And it's number 17 in the world, with 2.4 million infections and 72,000 deaths. And as a way of comparison, you will find that other countries in Southern Africa, they are hovering from generally about number 100, in fact 98 in the world. Mozambique is the next with higher numbers. In Southern Africa, 126,000 infections. Namibia, 119,000 infections. Botswana, 115,000 infections. And Zimbabwe, 112,000. I think Lesotho is the one that is the least numbers. But we are currently in a third wave, and a variant, I think they call it the Delta variant, which has been quite rapid in terms of its spread, but also its mortality. I think the mortality rate, you're looking at generally about 17, the mortality rate, yeah, it could be, the infection rate rather is around 17% average for Southern African countries, but with quite a steep mortality rate with the Delta variant. So this study, Secretary General Martin, it comes at a very important period where we need to take stock to try and build back better, to try and see how we can prevent the COVID environment of lockdown of human rights from becoming the new normal. So my colleague Depros Mchena always said that it started as a health pandemic, it became a human rights pandemic, it became a socio-economic rights justice pandemic. It also then became a dictatorship pandemic, because a number of governments have taken advantage of the COVID lockdown measures in order to achieve political rather than public health outcomes. So I think it's very, very important to have a group such as this one, of eminent judges and jurists who can be able to give us, a knowledge tool that can then be used to shape policy and formulate the response procedures. And we have a very good panel of speakers. Justice Sanji Monacheng, I'll just introduce all of them at once before I ask them to come in. And you feel free, colleagues, to expand a little bit about those areas that you may want the audience to know about you. But Justice Sanji Monacheng, I really come a long way with her. When I was appointed the secretary of the Law Society of Zimbabwe in 2004. Justice Monacheng, at that time, I think I'm correct to say that you were still the secretary of the Law Society of Botswana. So as a result, I immediately looked up to her as my mentor. And we've been generally very much in contact in terms of professional trajectory. From being the secretary, she was involved in the formation of the SADC Lawyers Association with other bar leaders. And then soon thereafter, she was appointed a judge by the Commonwealth and deployed to Swaziland and then the Gambia. And then she also grew to become a commissioner at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, where she rose to become the chairperson of the African Commission. And then thereafter, she was appointed to the International Criminal Court as a judge of the ICC, where she also became the vice president of the International Criminal Court. And then she's also a member of AJJF and then a member of the International Commission of Jurists. So she's got a lot of experience, and we're really privileged, Judge, that you can find time to be with us. Then we also have Caroline. Caroline, you will forgive me that I'll just introduce you as one of the sponsor, as the primary sponsor, OSISA, and she's deputy director at the Open Society Initiative of Southern Africa. That has given a lot of oxygen to many human rights groups at a time when the pandemic was really threatening to disrupt, activism. And so, were it not for the way in which OSISA quickly structured their vehicle for support of human rights groups to be able to look at how to continue the work of activism whilst at the same time contributing to combating COVID, we wouldn't be where we are now. So we are really, really grateful to you, Caroline, for your leadership, but also to OSISA. Then Martin Masiga is the Secretary General of the Africa Judges and Jurists Forum. She used to be the deputy director at the Africa program of the International Commission of Jurists, where we were. Martin, you can mute. He used to be the deputy director at the International Commission of Jurists, and he and Justice Chinengo, Justice Dingake, Justice Monaheng, Justice Thomas Masuku, Qinisile Mabuza from Swaziland, Eswatini, they were instrumental in the idea that many groups agitate for independence of the judiciary. But our experience during the brief period we were at the ICJ was that we didn't focus enough on what would happen to judges who depicted independence, but then became the subject of persecution. So many of them would walk the streets free and roam the streets without employment and being used as an example by dictatorship and autocratic regimes that it is dangerous to be an independent and impartial judge, and you would walk the street and there's no safety net. So the Africa Judges and Jurists Forum was primarily created to try and give a voice to judges to be agents that support each other, that fought collectively for the independence of the judiciary, as well as providing a safety net in the event that judges became targeted as a result of depicting independence and impartiality. And then he worked for the UN, and then he was also a director for Urinet. Then Justice, I don't know if Justice is here. Justice is one of the preeminent jurists, lawyers, who is currently the coordinator of the Center for Independence of Judges and Lawyers Global at the ICJ. He's one of the brightest prospects in terms of emerging jurists, and he has a reputation that is so larger than his age, and we're very proud to have Justice with us. And then Colette Letlojane, EURISA Executive Director. She has been a strong fighter for human rights and democracy in Southern Africa. She has provided leadership to the collective human rights defender groups in Southern Africa as the focal point for the NGO forum within the auspices of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights sessions. She organizes civil society in Southern Africa to be able to identify advocacy issues that are important for each of the sessions that comes at the African Commission, and is a strong pillar in terms of understanding the African human rights system and helping civil society to work. Then we have Dr. Itumeleng Shale, who is a member of the Lesotho Bar. She's one of the preeminent legal scholars in Lesotho and a member of the African Judges and Jurors Forum. She's a very strong feminist, and we're very privileged to have her here. And then Justice Moses Chinengo is currently the chairperson of the African Judges and Jurors Forum board, and he's a judge of the Supreme Court, judge of the Court of Appeal in Lesotho. Currently, he's helping in the Supreme Court of Namibia, correct me, Judge, if I'm wrong, to deal with some of the cases that it became necessary for the Namibian judiciary to get an experienced hand to try and resolve, working together with Justice Ernest Sakala, who is the former Chief Justice of Zambia, but and an elder in the judicial elders group of the African Judges and Jurors Forum. So Justice Chinengo really provides us with inspirational leadership. He used to be a High Court judge in Zimbabwe and a High Court judge in Botswana, and he's a recognized global arbitrator. And we're very privileged to have him providing leadership to us. So I think with that, in terms of introducing the speakers, let me get to maybe the basic house rules that I think each one of the speakers will speak for any time between 5 and 10 minutes. Martin, you can correct me. Justice Sanji will speak for about 10 minutes. Caroline, similar, 5-10 minutes if you can, and everyone else. And then on the audience, if you feel that there's something that you want to contribute, please feel free to raise things in the chat box or to raise your hand, and then I'll be able to give you an opportunity to speak. And then, but generally raise a hand and interrupt me if you feel that there's something that you want us to do. And without doing much further than that, Justice Sanji Monacheng, would you mind giving us the opening remarks?
Thank you very much, Arnold, and thank you for those good words about me. At times we sit back and say, is he really talking about me? I would like to express my gratitude to all organizers of this webinar and to those that participated in conducting this very, very important study. As a member of the Africa Judges and Jurors Forum, the AJJF, I'd also wish to thank the Open Society Initiative of Southern Africa, or CISA, through our sister, for the support that they have extended to the AJJF for work to promote human rights in the context of the fight against COVID-19. Like Arnold said, this issue is a human rights and rule of law one, and it calls upon people like us to augment what governments are doing, to advise them, and to help encourage them to listen to us and to other like-minded groups. As the world grapples with the unprecedented COVID-19 crisis, many people and governments across the globe found themselves in many difficult and peculiar situations in efforts to contain the situation. The responses by many governments had potentially far-reaching consequences for economies, social and political lives. The priority was to save lives. And given the exceptional situation and the imperative to preserve life, many countries had no choice but to adopt extraordinary measures. In the result, extensive lockdowns were adopted to slow down the rates of transmission of the virus. Several fundamental rights were impacted and restricted, such as the right to freedom of movement and many other human rights in the process. As the Secretary General of the United Nations noted in his policy brief in April 2020, human rights are key in shaping the pandemic response both for the public health emergency and the broader impact on people's lives and livelihoods. Human rights are inherent in every human being and should only be limited if necessary and or as may be reasonable in a democratic society. The COVID-19 pandemic should never be used as an excuse to violate rights willy-nilly, as we have seen in some jurisdictions. It is also important that any limitations that are imposed should endure for as long as it is necessary. Responses that are shaped by and respect human rights yield better outcomes in beating the pandemic, ensuring health care for everyone and preserving human dignity. It must be noted that some governments implemented emergency measures in the form of COVID-19 regulations in good faith, some of which had unforeseen or unintended consequences for people's rights. Other governments, however, may be said to have weaponized the pandemic and used emergency measures to deliberately target certain groups and repress citizens' rights. It is important to ensure that all measures to combat COVID-19 are implemented based on the law, which should be publicly available to all citizens, and that opportunities exist for these regulations and measures to be challenged in courts by aggrieved citizens. The police, and in some cases the army, were called upon to enforce compliance with the lockdown regulations. However, the enforcement of these regulations by law enforcement officials generated a lot of controversies and public outcry, as there were some violations of human rights in some countries in the region. Some governments passed restrictive laws, such as overly broad emergency laws, under the guise of fighting the pandemic. Citizens, journalists, and human rights defenders experienced harassment and intimidation. International human rights law recognizes that in the context of officially proclaimed public emergencies, including in public health, which threaten the life of a nation, restrictions on some rights can be justified. Those limitations, however, need to comply with international standards. While international law is clear on the limitations, some states have gone beyond justifiable restrictions with negative consequences on civic space and human rights, while also creating additional barriers for already excluded groups. From censoring citizens due to the alleged spread of fake news on the pandemic, to targeting media outlets and detaining journalists. We see this happening almost all the time. In some countries, freedom of expression has continuously come under attack during the pandemic. Journalists were arrested and charged with spreading fake news. And this was particularly concerning given the importance of having access to accurate information and the crucial role of journalists and the media during the pandemic. With the pandemic, many excluded groups have faced additional risks and violations. While the lockdown measures could have contributed significantly to limiting the spread of the pandemic, they also have caused significant damage to regional economies, which has impacted most on the poorest and most vulnerable sections of society, including women, persons living with disabilities, children, and migrant populations, among others. Even before the pandemic, large sections of the SADC population lived below the poverty line, with severe challenges in accessing employment, adequate food, quality healthcare, quality education, and adequate shelter. This had adverse ramifications for the enjoyment of socio-economic rights of the majority of the people in the region. Like other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Southern Africa posted some of the worst social indices globally. This situation was only made worse, or much worse, by the pandemic. Dear colleagues, as I conclude, I would like to thank the Secretariat of the African Judges and Jurors Forum for having undertaken this study. To you, our participants at this webinar, I wish all of us fruitful deliberations and hope that conversations such as these can help to catalyze a convergence of ideas that will be used to improve the state of human rights in our region. And finally, I thank the forum for having invited me to share these few thoughts with you. I thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Sanji, and we take note of your clear articulation that international human rights law recognizes that in the context of officially proclaimed public emergencies, including public health with threatened right to life, there may be restrictions that are justified, but that those limitations need to comply with international standards, and that the limitations, if they go beyond justifiable restrictions with negative consequences on civic space and human rights, there's also need for the states to be called out. And I think that is extremely important. So I will go to the next presenter, the representative from OSISA. I don't know whether Caroline is here. If not, maybe Zimbabwe Chimbwa. But as I said in my introduction remarks, I don't think there is any foundation in the world that has made as much contribution to defending human rights during the COVID pandemic as the Open Society have done. And they were very quick to mobilize resources as well as technical expertise and redirect a lot of energy to ensure that the COVID lockdown measures and attendant human rights did not become the new normal. So we're very privileged that as the Africa Judges and Jurors Forum, we've been able to work with OSISA to produce some of these knowledge tools. So without wasting too much time, over to you, Caroline or Z.
Hello, Arnold, and hello, good morning, everybody else.
Yes, Caroline,
can you hear
thank
me,
you.
colleagues?
Yes,
okay.
We can hear you, please.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Arnold, for your introductory remarks. A lot of what you have said there is actually what I've talked about, basically about the evolution of COVID when it started, when we were hit by this pandemic. I remember as OSISA, our immediate reaction was, oh my goodness, people are going to die. So the first thing therefore to do is to save lives. And there we were, a lot of grants we gave out at the time, had to do with, protecting lives, basically. But we have seen such a, an evolution and such a change over time, to the way the pandemic has been treated. And many of you have already spoken to that. It's such that, we have had to work, very on our feet to try and adjust and follow through, what is happening on the ground to ensure that, the support that we are providing and, the strategies that are being devised, it respond immediately to what is on the need, on the ground and the needs on the ground as such. And so, Arnold, I really don't have much to say, just to appreciate you as our partners, because as you know, for us to be able to respond, it's because we are able to get, information from you, people who are on the ground, from our partners who are on the ground, who give us, very quick and important information around, you know, the nuances of the pandemic, you know, what we can do, how people are being affected and so forth. And ours has been simply to sort of facilitate recognizing the expertise that you hold in different organizations, and respecting that, you know, our partners on the ground know what they are doing, and that, you know, they are doing the best they can to respond, you know, to this very difficult situation, themselves being, you know, taking huge risks in doing so as well. I mean, from the time this pandemic started, I think nobody has rested. People on the ground have to, you know, juggle with the need to respond to human rights abuses that we are seeing now, but also the need to protect their own lives. So we know that it's tough. It cannot be easy out there. And so I think it's just for us to appreciate this effort from AJJF. I also wanted to say that this report is also particularly important because, you know, when civil society organizations speak out and challenge governments on various, you know, human rights abuses, normally we get asked the question, so where is the legitimacy of the information, you know, of your challenge and so forth? And normally we'll sort of just use experiential, you know, because we can see what is happening. But when a report like this one is out, then we now have the real evidence. We now have a well-researched piece of paper that has documented, that has spoken to victims, that have spoken to witnesses who can stand by this information, and therefore our advocacy out there with our governments now becomes credible, now is based on very credible information, and we can really hold them to account on the many various things that we are seeing that are really, really stepping away from protecting people under COVID to something else. Now we have seen how the pandemic is being used, even just to clamp down, you know, campaigns. I'm sitting here in Zambia where we are having our election next week, and COVID-19 has been used, you know, so much to try and clamp down the opposition, to try and, you know, close up their voices and their spaces, you know, so that only the ruling party is able to campaign on the ground. So this is very important, and it's such information that we need. If we have to sue, you know, governments or duty bearers, we can have this information and we can use it to our advantage. So I just wanted to speak about just 3 quick points, and just to sort of just to situate where we are now as OSISA in terms of the key things that we are going to be looking at now, seeing that we have now come from a long way in terms of trying to protect lives, but also fighting autocracy and the abuse of human rights. We realize that now we are now at a stage where we are looking at the vaccines. And I just wanted to encourage us that, you know, since we have now witnessed developed countries holding vaccines, we should now up our agenda in terms of ensuring that no one is left behind in terms of accessing these vaccines. And so it's very key, you know, that we join once again hands, because now as we analyze our strategy and as we go back to our strategy as OSISA, we see that this is the next most important thing to address. And indeed, some of the agencies that we work with and partners might by now have already started, you know, working around vaccine issues, especially as regards also dealing with the apathy, you know, that is coming with people's response to the vaccine, while we work on the bigger agenda of access to the vaccine itself. So I thought that without saying much, I think that this is something we should also think about. Within our backyards, we have our uncles and sisters and brothers who continue to refuse to take the vaccine. And so I think this work is now upon us to try and ensure that, you know, how do we sensitize, how do we demystify and ensure that, you know, when the vaccine does come, we get it, but at the same time fighting the bigger agenda of not leaving anyone behind, so that developed countries begin to also release vaccines for the developing world. So that is one. We have already spoken to the abuse of laws and breakdown in the rule of law, which has led to an increase in those arrested, delays in accessing justice for those awaiting trials, and a militarized response to enforcing the pandemic, as seen in the deployment of the police and army. So instead of being protected, more human rights centered approach, which takes the population into confidence and enables citizens to play an active role, is responding to the spread of the violence. So again, this is something that has already been talked to, but also more concerning is the regression in socioeconomic development, again, and human rights, where national health systems are overburdened as a result of low investment by states. This is something, as OSISA, we've even had to sort of, respond to very quickly. If you remember at the beginning, we had incidences where in many hospitals, there were not even bed spaces, or even the beds themselves. And as OSISA, what we had to do was to provide, beds and a lot of PPEs to ensure that we support that regression, in the socioeconomic arena, but also support the struggling, health systems around the region because of the overwhelming numbers of people who are getting sick. We have seen that citizens are unable to earn a livelihood as a result of lockdown restrictions, and yet we do not have inclusive social security systems. And so this is something, again, that we have begun opening discussions around how do we ensure that, in this now we have learned our lessons, how do we ensure that going forward, we begin to think about inclusive social security systems and social security safety nets, so that once a pandemic like this one has hit, people have something to fall back upon, because the lockdowns now have totally taken away, their means of livelihoods, and therefore increasing, the advent of hunger and poverty. Of course, this reality calls for an African countries to be less dependent on developed countries or nations, particularly in manufacturing, and the health value chain, so that we can also begin to think on our feet and on our own, what is it that we can do as Africa, as a region, so that increasingly, I'm sure there are many more pandemics that are going to hit us in the future, but increasingly we begin to think about what are some of the strategies that we can put, in place on our own, so that when such things hit, we are able to even manufacture, even things like, vaccines. I remember at the time when we were trying to procure, beds for certain hospitals around the region, we had to be made to really wait in a long queue simply for a bed, a bed that you put in a hospital. We are not able, in our own region to produce such beds. And we had to wait, in a long queue and depend on only one country, South Africa, who could do that. And so I think that this kind of ability should be able to spread, across the region, so that, we don't have to deal with such simple things when a pandemic hits. So these are some of the things we are thinking about around how do we position ourselves now to ensure, like I said before, to ensure that even vaccines, we are able to access them. Now, we have seen where an awakening has come as far as vaccines are concerned and getting the vaccine, but still we are lagging behind because we do not have the capacity to provide our own vaccines. So just to go back to emphasize that this is one of the agendas that we are now pushing, and indeed, I'm taking this opportunity to just alert you as one of our partners that we need to join hands to think about this. And please do let us know if you have any ideas around how we can really ensure that this agenda is handled, and how we can strategize around this agenda. again, going back, I think we are already doing a lot to sort of, curb the abuse, human rights abuse done in the name of COVID, which is good. And finally, just emphasizing the need for us to look at our socio-economic breakdown within the region as a result of, COVID pandemic, but also to think about alternatives and strategies for ensuring that we are able to do these things on our own. We're able, to provide especially this inclusive social security safe nets and systems that we can fall back on so that the poverty levels for our people do not continue to escalate just because of poverty, but we have something to fall back on. So really, Arnold, this is what I thought I could bring to this group and to this very important meeting, just using it really as an opportunity to sort of, talk about what we have started thinking about as OSISA, but once again, to really appreciate this piece of, work. This report, like I said before, is so important, especially for ensuring that it gives us a backup. It's a backup document, and it provides the legitimacy for us to continue fighting and advocating as we talk about human rights, abuse in the context of the COVID pandemic. So I'll leave it here for now. Thank you so much, Arnold, but I'll have to drop off very soon because I have another meeting. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot, Caro. We really appreciate that you could find time to be with us and to share with us those wise words. And I really want to thank you personally for your personal leadership and the encouragement that you continue giving to civil society in Southern Africa to keep fighting back and trying to build better. And I totally agree with you that we really need all hands on the deck, and in particular with us at the Africa Judges and Jurors Forum. I think we're quite privileged to have maybe a group of the progressive judges from within the region. It's very unusual sometimes to have civil society groups that are joined by members of the judiciary who may actually be sitting judges. And I hope that by this experience and the knowledge that we get from them, but which they also get from some of the wise words that you give, it can help to improve the jurisprudence, because we can't underemphasize the importance of progressive jurisprudence as part and parcel of a building block of the policy regime that shapes the way in which Southern Africa is developing. And the points you may raise around the question of vaccine hesitancy, we really need to address it because we don't have good numbers to reach the herd immunity. But the question of vaccine availability, again, the vaccine nationalism, imperialism that we have seen, and some competition around vaccine diplomacy, where we as Africans or people in Africa are simply operating on the trickle-down effect rather than on effect of the lives of people in Africa, just like lives of people anywhere in another continent, being exactly the same in terms of value, and therefore the need for justice and equitability in the distribution of vaccines. So I think the waste in human beings is also brought about by the COVID itself, and the fact that of global inequality in terms of the current world order that needs to be addressed. And then the issue of state capacity and a failure to adequately invest in public health infrastructure, as well as production of vaccines and other equipment, including beds that may be needed at hospitals. That's really a shame, because it points at us that African leaders were waiting for Europe, for America, for China, for Russia to provide us with vaccines, and there was no leadership at the level of investing in research and development. And I'm hoping that that is a lesson that we have learned, so that we can begin to be a bit more dependent on ourselves in terms of the fate that we face as a continent. And then, the COVID being used as an excuse to undermine electoral democracy. And it's not Zambia alone. Zambia has done it in a very brazen way, just like Tanzania and Uganda did it. And we see that a bit also in Zimbabwe, where, you know, there are suspensions of elections as well as you know, suspension or banning of political activity. So in that situation, you find that COVID is being used as a pretext to try and consolidate power, and in the process undermine the growth of democracy. And ultimately, we see situations of democratic regression and authoritarian consolidation. So without further ado, I really want to thank you, Carol. I will ask the Secretary General of the Africa Judges and Jurors Forum, Martin Masiga, you have the floor.
On behalf of the Secretariat of Africa Judges and Jurors Forum, and before I address the substance of the study, I would like to thank the program moderator, Arnold Tsunga, as well as the panelists for having accepted to take part in this launch. We clearly have a panel of regionally and internationally distinguished judges, jurists, and human rights promoters. Thank you, Justice Sanji Monaheng, Justice Moses Chinengo, Dr. Alfred Mavedzenge, Dr. Itumeleng Shale, and veteran human rights defender Colette Declaration. I've known Colette since 2002, I think. In a special way, I would like to express AJJF's gratitude to Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa, which is represented here by Caroline, the Deputy Director. Your support has enabled us conduct this study and other activities to promote human rights and the rule of law in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Please, Caroline, when you return to your office, carry with you a message from AJJF to your colleagues, starting with your director, Sipasami Malunga, and including Nikiwe Kaunda, Zimbabwe Chimbwa, Ayanda Zwane, Levison Kabwata Lona, and others whose names I may not have mentioned here, but with whom we have worked quite closely to get these projects going. Colleagues, before 2020, few, if at all, but most likely none of us, ever imagined that there would be one day, let alone months, when life in the entire world would come to a standstill. But such was the threat that coronavirus posed to the existence of the human race that it required extraordinary measures by governments around the world to counter it. We must admit that in a cultural environment where human rights was respected only in rhetoric, exceptional actions by governments were always bound to have multifaceted effects, even on human rights. The objective of this study and its limitations, with international travel banned and lockdowns in virtually all the countries under study, the study relied on desk research and some limited interviews were made. On the law, it must be stated from the outset that human rights law at domestic, regional, and international level allows reasonable limitation of some human rights when faced with a natural disaster such as the COVID-19 pandemic. However, such limitations of rights must be consistent with the principles of proportionality and non-discrimination. Further, some rights are non-derogable and must be respected even during the subsistence of a national disaster or a public emergency, such as the coronavirus presented Southern Africa with. The study arrives at some key findings, which I'm going to discuss below. What I'm doing here is simply sharing a sneak peek of the contents of the report, Otherwise, for the details of the report, one would have to look at the report itself, which Justice Chinengo is going to launch this morning, and will be immediately available on this chart and on our website. Finding number 1. Emergency measures have resulted in the limitation of non-derogable rights, including the right to life and to freedom from torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, and the right to human dignity. On the right to life, on 26 September 2020, in a case of reckless and unwarranted brutality, police shot and killed a 17-year-old boy while purporting to enforce COVID-19 regulations in a Lusaka nightclub. In Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum documented 4 cases of extrajudicial killings during the first 180 days of the COVID-19 lockdown, just in 180 days alone. On freedom from torture and other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment and punishment, Botswana had 3 prominent cases, including one where a 22-year-old girl moving with her 18-year-old brother were assaulted by police somewhere in
It's 12 hours
near Lubate while enforcing COVID-19 lockdown regulations. The president issued a press release and promised to investigate the case, but nothing has come out of those promises yet. There was also the ordeal of the opposition politician Nicholas Huputso of the Umbrella for Democratic Change, who was allegedly harassed by 12 police officers for allegedly causing noise during the COVID-19 lockdown. And then there was the stripping naked and depriving Oratile Dikuluhang of oxygen during police interrogation. He had been accused and charged over Facebook posts around COVID-19 and the local politics of Botswana. In Zambia, the Human Rights Commission, at the time of this research, and this research was conducted last year, reported that they had received and were investigating more than 10 cases of alleged torture, mainly at the hands of Zambian police service, and that some of these cases were constituting aggravated torture and resulted in the death of the victims. In Zimbabwe, 3 leaders of the opposition MDC Alliance Party were on 13th of May 2020 subjected to enforced disappearances, were sexually harassed, sexually assaulted and abandoned somewhere in Bindura. Unknown assailants abducted Tawanda Mchehiwa in Bulawayo. He sustained serious injuries, with the doctors who attended to him saying he was exhibiting symptoms of acute renal failure. The judgment in Lucia Mashondo and Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights against Home Affairs and Cultural Heritage and others, prohibiting police from using unwarranted and disproportionate force against citizens in Zimbabwe in the enforcement of national lockdown, did little, if nothing, to stop the police. The other finding is that some restrictive measures do not actually meet the requirements of reasonableness, necessity, and proportionality. These include, but are not limited to, the demolition of vending market stalls in Zimbabwe, for instance, which is a big problem, and the criminalizing of public critique of government responses to the pandemic. On 9th April in Zimbabwe, in Zambia, the broadcasting regulator cancelled Prime TV's license. It is noted that the independent broadcaster has been, that Prime TV has been a critic of the government and had refused to flight government's COVID-19 adverts for free. Laws were passed to criminalize the generation and exchange of corona-related information, which was not sourced from the government in a number of countries, and several people were prosecuted under these provisions. Look at Botswana alone, where police arrested a school teacher called Raki Kilesamile for personal observations that he had made on his Facebook page, and that he had questioned a claim by government that a social worker who had screened lawmakers during a heated parliamentary debate on the emergency had tested positive for the coronavirus. He also questioned why people infected with COVID-19 in hospital were not receiving or were not recovering or developing further complications. And he was arrested and charged for misinformation under Article 30 of the Emergency Powers Act. In another incident, again, police detained Justice Matlavane, is Justice, not the judge, but a name, and Oratile de Kulaheng. It must be noted that these are actually allied to the opposition, to the party of the former President Ian Khama. So they were detained for posting, so it was claimed, for posting information that intended to deceive readers or any person of the real intentions and measures taken by the government to address COVID-19. Their postings were later disabled by police after the police withdrew the passwords from the three accused people. The Zambia Information and Communications Technology Authority generated and distributed mass texts threatening to prosecute any persons who disseminated false information related to COVID-19. You know, the third key finding is that unreasonable restrictive measures have been deleterious to the right of access to livelihoods across the region, and the report discusses those instances. The fourth, several rights and fundamental freedoms have been curtailed as part of the response to the pandemic, and these include but are not limited to the right to social security, adequate health care, adequate housing, access to water, dignity, and equality. I think in Zimbabwe, there were cases around some of these issues. There was litigation around water and issues around socioeconomic rights. The COVID-19 pandemic has been used as a cover to deprive people of political representation, restrict civic space, and strengthen authoritarianism. For example, in Zambia, as Caroline just mentioned and repeated by Arnold, in Zambia, we know the ruling party, the Patriotic Front, has continued to hold uninterrupted public meetings, and security agents, together with the PF supporters, have reportedly stopped or interrupted any opposition party meetings under the guise of enforcing COVID regulations. For long, the government had used the Draconian Public Order Act to curtail opposition parties' activities. But now the COVID-19 situation is actually working even better for them than the Public Order Act. Finally, the study makes some recommendations, some of which Caroline has mentioned quite forcefully, as though she had been part of this study already. One is that states should prepare to invest adequate efforts in securing vaccines to inoculate the populations of the region. Vaccines should be administered promptly and free of charge to all populations, including rural areas, without discrimination. And that's where Caroline's idea of leaving no one behind comes. AJJF recommends that practical legal measures be taken to ensure that the victims of these violations obtain appropriate relief, which restores the rights and deters against future violations. And this should include, but not limited to, damages and personal costs against the perpetrators. Law enforcement and security forces must be provided with adequate human rights education to sensitize them about their duty to observe non-derogable rights at all times, including and during states of public emergency. Well, we talk about law enforcement and security agencies being provided with adequate human rights training. I think that is good. It treats the symptom. It doesn't treat the problem. The problem is the culture, because if the culture is permissive, if the executive pass on by their conduct information that harassing people, especially if the opposition is proper and will go without check, then law enforcement agencies will always do it, because they'll be doing it on behalf of the executive. The fourth recommendation we make is that authorities should regularly review the restrictions and discontinue those which are not strictly necessary to combat the spread of COVID-19. Compensation, again, must be considered in line with regional and international law for the victims of human rights violations arising from the implementation of unnecessary restrictive measures. We also recommend that authorities establish specialized oversight mechanisms dedicated to monitoring and implementation of restrictive measures to ensure compliance with the domestic, regional, and international law. AJJF also recommends measures to be undertaken to enforce more. I will leave that. Some governments use the pandemic as a cover to strengthen the authoritarianism and deprive people of their right to political representation. We recommend that states must respect and protect the right to political participation and representation. In particular, AJJF calls upon states to ensure that the right to regular, free, and fair elections be respected during the pandemic in line with domestic, regional, and international law. As a lesson learned from the ongoing vaccine hoarding by the rich nations, which has been variously referred to as vaccine nationalism or vaccine appetite, the region should take a long-term view to the promotion of the health of its people and their protection during times of a public emergency. Governments must therefore take deliberate steps to reduce overdependence on international pharmaceutical supply chains by investing in scientific innovation back home. There are some governments that are doing this, I'm aware, but I think the efforts are still limited. I know that Kenya has invested through KEMRI in the local development of vaccines and cures. In Uganda now they have developed, there are 3 vaccine candidates that are being conducted, that are being considered, and their therapeutics also being considered. But again, because Africa is not known for innovation, we lack confidence in ourselves. We always believe we need approval. So I see that one of the vaccines being researched upon in Uganda has by itself invited the American National something Federal Drug Agency to work with it just because they want to have this affirmation by the international community that indeed this is a genuine innovation. That is okay for now, because it's good to start. It's good to start these innovations, but we must continue. With them. When there was some time during the first wave, the African Development Bank recorded 182 innovations that had been made by Africans around coronavirus. But I think many of them could actually have been abandoned, partly because we just don't have the confidence in ourselves that we can make it, or that when we produce, what we produce can be and will be respected internationally. There is another or two, actually, two areas which Caroline mentioned, which we discussed, but I think finally did not find their way into the recommendations here. I don't see them here. But we had recommended that African governments be encouraged and engaged to invest more in the development of health infrastructure and systems, and also around discussions on developing inclusive social safety systems. So that is, those are some of the recommendations that we make. We are interested and willing to take some of these forward in different fora through advocacy and other means. So finally, I would like to thank all my colleagues who have helped to put this webinar together, including Constance Mukarati, Mamukeleni Tsunga, and Michael Mwesiga. In the interest of time, I'll leave it here and thank all of you for having listened to me.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Secretary General. And you say in the interest of time, after I think you'd already consumed quite a significant amount of time. but when a leader speaks, what can you do as a moderator? You wait until they exhaust their interest. So I still plan colleagues for us to finish at 12:30, which is in about 15 minutes. So the group that is left, Dr. Mavizenge, do you mind to summarize your findings in just about 5 minutes?
I can try to do that quickly.
Yes, sir.
I can try to do that quickly.
You're my favorite academic. So when I ask for an indulgence, thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Arnold. Thanks, colleagues, and thanks for the honor. All protocols observed since I have 5 minutes. I think I changed my presentation this morning because I thought that there is something that probably we need to share as colleagues who are working on these issues. And I'm glad that I changed, because having listened to Martin and listened to the colleagues who spoke before Martin, I think what I want to say fits very well, because my focus is how do we move forward from where we are now? How do we move forward? How do we take what we now know what Martin presented, what it means. We know what it means in terms of the situation of human rights in the context of the pandemic. But now how do we move forward? How do we use the data that Martin has presented, these findings? How do we use them going forward? So I still think that we must continue to press governments. Forgive me if I'm speaking too fast and I'm not giving too much detail. It's because I want to recover time. So I think we should keep on insisting that governments should take a human rights-centered approach in dealing with the pandemic. But in practical terms, that simply means that the restrictions that are to be imposed by states must conform to the three key legal standards, which are lawfulness, necessity, and proportionality. So as civil society, as lawyers, and as judges, we must continue to look at, and we must continue to engage with those three key legal standards and apply them as means to ensure that the restrictions that are imposed by governments, to ensure that states take a human rights-centered approach to dealing with this pandemic. I don't want to talk about lawfulness today. I don't want to talk about necessity today, because I think in the previous presentations in other spaces, there's been a lot of conversation about what lawfulness and necessity means. And I also see that in the room, there are eminent jurists, there are judges who know what these things mean. So I'm happy to skip those two and rather reflect more on proportionality. I want to reflect more on proportionality because that was what was on my mind this morning when I woke up and I was thinking about this event. And then I changed my presentation from what it was. So proportionality basically means that the restrictions must be reasonable and proportionate to the danger or threat posed by the virus. In other words, the restrictions that are imposed by government must be rational, right? But how do we measure proportionality in practical terms? I think this is the question that we need to reflect on going forward. How do we measure proportionality in practical terms? How do we as civil society and lawyers help our judges to measure proportionality when we challenge these restrictions in court, or when we actually engage states in dialogue or governments in dialogue? How do we help them to measure proportionality? I want to suggest that two things. We need reliable data which shows existing and projected trends on infections, positivity rate, rate of recovery, and mortality rate. Unfortunately, maybe as lawyers, we have stayed away from those things, thinking that it's for the doctors to deal with. But I think we need to engage with that data. We also need reliable data on vaccine procurement, distribution, effectiveness of the vaccine, as well as data on the capacity of the healthcare system within the country. So we need to pay attention to that data. If that data is not there, we need to invoke the law to compel governments to create that data, to collect that data rather, and to make that data publicly accessible, because that data will help us to evaluate whether the measures that are being put in place by governments or restrictive measures are proportional or not. Now, let me just give quick illustrations of proportionality. So one of the issues is that for these measures to be proportionate, they must be time specific. So for example, the declaration of states of emergency or states of disaster must be time specific. We should move away from the tendency of indefinite states of emergency, indefinite states of disaster. We have that problem here in Southern Africa, but we also have some countries in West Africa who have taken that approach. The second thing on time specificity is that the length of time for the state of emergency, the length of time for the state of disaster must be informed by existing and projected trends of COVID infections, data on the state of the healthcare system, and data on the distribution and effectiveness of the vaccine. So when a country imposes a 1-year-long state of emergency or a 1-month-long state of disaster, does that correlate with the data that I mentioned? That is a question that as lawyers and scientists, we need to engage with and assist. It will assist us in demonstrating whether the length of time is not consummate or is not based on data, and therefore is not rational. The second aspect is that the geographic scope of implementation of the restrictive measures itself does not necessarily have to be nationwide. So there's a tendency to impose nationwide curfews, nationwide restrictions on public gatherings, nationwide lockdowns. But these restrictive measures may be necessary, yes, in terms of their conception, but their geographic application must be informed by data. They must be informed by the spread of infections or the anticipated spread of infections, as well as the state of the healthcare system in each geographic zone. So in other words, we must go into each province, we must go into each zone and check if the existing and projected trend of infections justify a curfew to be applied in that zone or in that province. Restrictions on public gatherings to be imposed in that zone. So in other words, I'm saying let's think critically about the geographic application of these measures and move away from assuming that measures should always be nationwide. Then next is the severity of measures or the severity of restrictions. Whenever I'm saying measures, I'm referring to restrictions. So the severity of restrictions. For example, the length of curfew hours must be informed by data. It is not a given that we must always just have a curfew. Also, it is not a given, okay, on what basis do we have a curfew from 12 midnight to 4 a.m.? On what basis do we have a curfew in another country from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m.? The length of the curfew hours must be based on data. There must be a rational relationship between the data that I described earlier on and the need for a curfew. Second, the hours that make up the curfew. The next on the severity of restrictions is restrictions on public gatherings must mirror existing or projected data in regions and provinces within the country. So in a country like Zambia, where elections are forthcoming, and then there are all these restrictions on public gatherings. But the question is, do those restrictions mirror the amount of vaccines that are coming into the country, the state of the healthcare system, the rate of infections? Because we also know that different portions of society are reacting differently to this virus. That's why in some countries, and I'm not in any way encouraging countries to take a laid-back approach, but the reality is also that in some countries restrictive measures are light, but the rate of infections is reportedly low. It's probably because human beings react differently. The levels of vulnerability are different. And therefore, that data must inform the severity of restrictions. Then lastly, is that I want to encourage ourselves to always remember that the primary focus of governments must not necessarily be on undertaking restrictive measures. These restrictive measures are supposed to be a temporary solution to mitigate the spread of the virus, or to mitigate against the spread of the virus. The focus of the government must be on taking reasonable measures to protect and promote the right to healthcare. In practical terms, this means that the state must take reasonable steps towards creating a situation where society is able to combat the spread of the virus without resorting to extremely severe restrictions. So, two things that we need to watch are data on the investment being made to procure and make appropriate vaccines accessible to those that are in need. And secondly, data on measures that are being taken to strengthen the capacities of the healthcare systems. So if there is not, if the state is failing, is not investing enough in healthcare systems, but at the same time, there's a lot of resource leakages, there's a lot of corruption going on, then I think we have, but at the same time, the state is maintaining severe restrictions. I think we would have a very strong case in terms of demonstrating that the state is failing to take reasonable measures to protect health. And as a result, the restrictive measures, in fact, the entire policy which anchors these restrictive measures then becomes irrational, because the focus of the government must not be primarily on maintaining restrictions. It must be on investing in the capacity of the society to withstand the pandemic, to survive the pandemic, and to become immune to the virus, or if the virus is still persistent, but to be less sick, if I can put it that way. So I think that's where I would like to end. I would have spoken more. I think there's a lot that I would have wanted to share in terms of,
I think,
but I think.
Yeah, when I heard your line of argument, especially around the question of proportionality and the link to data, I actually think we need maybe a separate conversation, especially if it's going to be possible to have that separate conversation with some of a wider network of judges from the region, because I think that's exactly at a practical level the things that go to court, and on which, if people are challenging, that's where the case can stand or fall. So I actually think it's a technical conversation that we need to plan for, and I hope the Secretary General has paid attention to that. Let me ask Colette. You can see that I've failed to keep the speakers to time. I'm wondering, colleagues who are listening, if you are able to give us an additional 10, at least no more than 15 minutes. Colette. It will give you 5 minutes. So let me ask, I think Colette has struggled.
I manage.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks. 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. It is an honor and a privilege to be part of this very important occasion of the launch of the AJJ study report on COVID-19 and state of compliance with human rights standards in the SADC region. I also wish to acknowledge the presence of Justice Sanji Munahe, who is also on the AJJ. I've just acronymized it, and also a former president of the ICC, and also the former chairperson of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, Justice Mozik Chihangu, and Justice Alfred Mabe Zenge, Dr. Ichimeleng Shale, AJJF, Ms. Caroline Kabambwe from OSISA, Martin Okumo Omasinga, all protocol duly observed. I just wanted to react as well from what has been discussed by the former speakers, to say that definitely COVID-19 became that instrument of distraction. The restrictions that were imposed to contain, to address the virus, became an advancement of destabilizing the very same mechanism, structures that are meant to be protected, because states hasten to take shortcuts without complying with many mechanisms, their own national structures, regional and international. I've heard Martin expressing that in terms of the law enforcement, the breakdown of the rule of law that we've seen increasing in the Southern Africa, and also the level of attacks that we have witnessed on the judiciary, especially where judgments are passed against some of those that are perceived to be suspect, and they occupy a very high position in public institutions. We have seen the tiering of this very institution that needs to serve the people. In terms of that, I will support the idea of providing capacity building training workshops to law enforcement. Our law enforcement, I think they've been operating from dark. For us in South Africa, I'll mention that they have not moved away from the past impunity of being characterized as a brutal law enforcement. We have seen the divisions in the manner in which they also act regarding managing or controlling protest or demonstrations. In South Africa, we've seen that if a protest is exposing corruption, is lamenting, it brings the plight of the people, especially gender-based violence, the economic and social rights that have not been delivered, and also abuse of state powers, especially in certain areas where communities are pure, communities expect to be consulted. In the mining communities, we've seen that actually those areas, police do not exercise the due process of the law. They just come in and commit these heinous crimes. It has been consistent, and there's double standards. If it's a gathering that is mainly to protect one that was we call those political gatherings, we've seen that police are very biased. Those participating in those marches or demonstrations, they receive coverage, they are protected, and they'll go and come back, regardless of the fact that they're breaking the very restrictive measures that are expected to be complied with by the society. And then also, he has mentioned that our own medicinal capacity being built, like we need to begin to rise up and diminish our dependence on foreign companies, pharmaceutical companies, and to be a begging continent, which has been, being transferred from generation to generation. I think we need to think about the future. I wanted to mention that the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, it has passed a resolution. A resolution is Resolution 449. And in that resolution, it has highlighted all the mechanisms that could guide the state parties in addressing the pandemic, in making sure that their actions, their mechanisms are human rights compliant. Every action they take, it must be, you must take into account the mechanism, regional mechanisms that we have. In it, we have the Abuja Declaration of 2001. That Abuja Declaration, I think it needs to be part of our advocacy, because it recommends that state parties, they must put aside 15% of their GDP towards health system. For example, we know that during the COVID-19, there's been shortages of medical equipment, the PPEs, and then also there's been a problem. There's been a problem of providing oxygens in some countries in the region. So I do support and agree with them. And I think the other parts which I think should be increased in it is the AJF to continue playing a role in the African Commission, because there is an interest group that has been established that will help the Commission and the judiciary in the region to continue functioning independently without fear and prejudice. I'll end here. I thank you.
No, thanks a lot, Colette. And you end on a very good note in terms of the role of the AJJF to push for more action at the African Commission. And I know that Martin has been trying to even move towards the establishment of a special rapporteur on independence of judges and lawyers at the African Commission. That is very, very useful. Let me ask Dr. Itumeleng, you have your 5 minutes before we wind up with Justice Chinengo. Dr. Itumeleng, shall I?
Perhaps just a minute, Mr. Moderator.
Yes.
Yes, perhaps I can assure you that I'm able to go up to 12. So if I know you were trying to accommodate me in a sense, but I'm able to go up to 12. And I also propose that perhaps you dedicate some 5 minutes, just a general discussion. I suppose that was part of your plan. Just a quick general discussion of the issues.
Okay, that's fine, because out of the 17 participants, 9 have already spoken. So that's okay. Dr. Itumeleng, try to be as brief as you can. And thanks, Justice Chinengo.
Thank you very much, Arnold. Thank you, all protocol observed. In the interest of time, I will not go through the protocol as I would love to, but I'll just observe all protocols so that I save time and speak in less than 5 minutes. I promise I'll take less than 5 minutes. And I would like, first of all, to commend the researchers and contributors to the report that is being launched, because they have laid ground for future research. They have also laid ground for states to know what human rights violations are and how such can be kept. We have all realized that COVID-19 came as a surprise, if I may say, to not only to African states, but to the world at large. At the time when COVID-19 hit, many constitutions had not anticipated a state such as that. So it was difficult for many states to know whether to declare states of emergency, states of disaster, and so on. So there had to be innovative ways of applying the Constitution. Some states, or many states, were at the crossroads as to how to protect right to life on the one hand, by making sure that the infection rate is kept, the curve is flattened, and at the same, on the other hand, protect the rights to freedom, protect freedoms from torture and other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatments. So states had to act speedily because the pandemic was fast spreading throughout the world. As Justice Monacheng rightly pointed, some states acted in good faith, even though in the process some human rights were violated, while other states found COVID-19 as a scapegoat, as an excuse for further human rights violations. Because when the pandemic hit, there were already rampant human rights violations in many African states. COVID-19 became an excuse to impose emergencies on the basis of which laws were used as tools to silence political opposition, as a means of corruption in other states. And the study comes at a time, or the report comes at a time, when the global south is worse hit by the third wave than the rest of the world. And it comes at a point where in many states, there is a new trend, a new threat to human rights. And this, while we had been talking about the violation of the right to freedom from torture, while talking about a limitation of liberty, freedom of movement, and so on, the emerging trend now is on access to healthcare. Access to healthcare has become a problem because there has been discrimination in as far as access to vaccines are concerned. There has been rampant violation of public procurement regulations and other rules relating to how this how these vaccines, the PPEs, and so on are procured. And this has become, or the emergency in quotes about the COVID-19 has become the basis on which corrupt leaders are becoming more corrupt. And this we see mostly through procurement processes that are not following the public procurement regulations. We see favors being granted in terms of tenders and so on and so forth. And at the same time, we also risk, as far as access to healthcare is concerned, substandard services that are provided. And the problem is, most of all, it's the poor that are going to be affected mostly by this new trend that affects mostly their access to healthcare. So this study has become a basis on which legal principles, such as the principle to proportionality, necessity, as Justice has rightly illustrated, have been defined. We have come to a point where they've been elaborated, they've been interpreted, not only by scholars, but as the report has said, as Martin was presenting, there is jurisprudence to that effect as well. We have jurisprudence that defines these principles, and therefore we have come to a point where states can no longer hide behind the emergency. We have come to a point where states can no longer hide behind the Constitution is not accommodating the pandemic. It's 2 years later, the pandemic is no longer an emergency. Therefore, states have to be held accountable as to the measures that they are taking to ensure that the right to health is protected, to ensure that the right to life is protected, and to ensure that all the challenges that were experienced earlier in the earlier waves of this pandemic can no longer be an excuse, because we now have jurisprudence, we now have data, we now have recommendations as to how some of these human rights can be balanced to avoid a situation where we sacrifice other human rights on the altar of saving lives. And on that note, Arnold, I believe that I have spoken less than 5 minutes, as I had promised, and I would like to thank you and the participants very much.
No, thanks a lot, Dr. Shelley. And I think you raise a fundamental point. The question you have asked, I don't know whether you are aware how fundamental it is, whether the pandemic is still an emergency or not. Because you see, many of the lockdown measures and many of the human rights violations that arose as a result of measures was because we were dealing with a public emergency. And so the question is, are we still in a public emergency 2 years down the line, or we have had enough time generally for societies to adjust and for states to adjust and be able to see that COVID is now part and parcel of the conditions that societies must live through, and therefore we need to move away from public emergencies into containment measures that look at COVID as a normal societal feature. I think that is extremely important. And then you also raised the question of that states with existing preconditions around undemocratic practices, authoritarian, they are the ones who have suffered more in terms of human rights violations. And I think that's also another valid point. So Justice, I prefer, Justice Chinengo, that we get into your session where you launch the book, and then we can then see if there will be questions afterwards. For now, I had encouraged colleagues to put any questions in the chat box, and I haven't seen any. And I assume that we don't have any questions for now. So may I hand it over to you, Justice Chinengo?
Thank you very much. I was still muted. Good morning to all colleagues. First of all, I would want to thank our sponsors, OSISA. Without their sponsorship, obviously, we would not have been able to produce this study. We have a team of very vibrant researchers, all mentioned in the acknowledgement to the study. And we thank them all for their commitment to the cause of human rights, the protection of human rights, and the promotion of human rights. The study has covered a number of countries in Southern Africa, and largely in the first year of the pandemic. A lot more, I think, has happened. I think we all would admit that a lot more has happened in 2021. If funds were available, one would have thought that a follow-up study would have been necessary. Sorry, I didn't have my gadgets all switched off. We have seen an increased number of persons being affected by coronavirus. Sorry, can I just?
Yeah, deal with that issue, Judge.
Yeah, I have to switch them off. Sorry about that. I was saying that we have seen a number of an increased number of persons being affected by the disease, and an increased number of persons dying from that disease. The disease or the virus is mutated, and we are currently in a phase 3 of the disease. The Delta variant, as Arnold referred to it, and as it is known. The study, though dealing with the first few months of the epidemic, I think laid bare certain inadequacies across the subject countries in dealing with the disease. There have been noted logistical inadequacies characterized even by small issues like a failure to provide PPEs. There has been attitudinal inadequacies manifesting themselves in the inability to enforce containment measures having regard to human rights and freedoms of the people. We have seen in the report that there has been politicization of the pandemic in order to gain political advantage by ruling elites or by ruling parties. We have seen victimization, as reported in the report, of political opposition parties and human rights defenders and members of the media and other activists. I think the point has been made by the discussants that AJJF has produced a study which will help in advancing the cause of human rights. Those who have observed the work of the AJJF, it is always to establish facts. And this study has provided facts upon which further action can be taken. And that is the main operational method of AJJF. And that you can see from the various fact-finding missions that the AJJF has carried out over the years. I think there still are a number of issues that remain to be considered. They've been highlighted by the discussants, the issues of the lawfulness, necessity, and proportionality of approaches. Of course, one of the methods of dealing with that is the test cases being brought before the courts. But one will also have to bear in mind that in dealing with a pandemic such as COVID-19, there's a tendency, even by the courts and by other actors, I suppose, to take a very cautious approach that in case you endorse or don't endorse certain actions and the pandemic turns out to be more disastrous, one would be careful not to assume liability in that regard. But there are issues that still have to be studied in depth. For instance, what one might, for lack of a better word, call forced vaccination or exclusion of persons who have refused to take the vaccine. What are the rights of the individual? The violation of individual rights in respect of vaccinations, has that been sufficiently studied? We need to study the need for cure of the virus. Of course, all this time, the concentration has been prevention, but there's the aspect of curing those who have gotten the disease. Then, of course, a point which was talked about on corruption, as it affected the procurement of vaccines and other things. These are all areas which AJJF, if properly resourced, would be able to assist by undertaking necessary studies. What I note, and what is noted in the report, is that we still suffer from what I would describe as base instincts, which have no place or application in this time and age. Torture, violence upon individuals, violation of human rights, all these things must be seen as things of a gone by age. In the 21st century, when law enforcement agencies still resort to violence against individuals, to violation of human dignity, I think Africa must wake up. And this is one of the implicit recommendations coming from the report. As I must say, the AJJF has the capacity to undertake studies of this nature in Africa. Our focus on human rights and development in Africa places us in pole position to carry out studies in all areas of law and development on our continent. This is the first. This is one of the studies we have carried out. I think a third of the studies we have carried out. We have carried out some studies on electoral practices and electoral jurisprudence, and so on and so on. And this is what AJF is in a position to do. Perhaps before ending my remarks, what Martin has said in respect of the conclusions or recommendations in the report. I think securing of vaccines and the administration of vaccines promptly is an important recommendation which governments must adopt. The derogation from non-derogable rights, it's a recommendation that must be adopted by our governments. The training of law enforcement personnel on human rights observations, I think that is an important recommendation. The implementation of the report refers to that as oversight mechanisms to monitor implementation of enforcement or containment measures. I think that is a very good recommendation that is in the report. There must be some mechanism for monitoring the implementation of the containment measures. This recommendation hopefully will be adopted by most of our governments. Then, of course, the issue around unnecessary restrictive measures to be discontinued. And I think the discussions have dealt with that quite commendably. The use of COVID to strengthen stranglehold over populations, to deal with election issues, all those are issues that this report makes recommendations on. And of course, we are worried, and the report highlights that the vaccine nationalism, lessons to which we have learned to be less dependent on other countries for health related issues. So this report is very important. This report will hopefully be read, distributed as widely as possible, and particularly to our governments in Southern Africa. And I hope most of all the recommendations in the report are going to be adopted by our respective governments. So in summary, I must say I'm quite pleased and honored to formally launch the AJJF a report or study on COVID-19 and the state of compliance with human rights standards in Southern Africa. This is the formal launching, and I'm pleased to participate in it. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. In terms of the rituals, Martin, on launch, did you have any specific way in which you wanted the document to be launched?
So now that he has launched, the chair of AJJF has launched it, we'll ask Constance to share it on this on the chat.
On the chat, excellent. Okay, so that's excellent. No, thank you very much, Judge, and for your remarks and for your leadership to the AJJF in terms of creating an institution that I think can be of increasing importance in terms of the rule of law and development in Africa. I also want to thank Martin Masiga as the head of Secretariat and your team for assembling this event. I also want to thank the researchers who worked with AJJF to produce the
13 hours,
which I believe is going to be useful to I mean to many jurisdictions, and so I think with those remarks, Martin, let me hand it over to you so that you can close.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for having participated. We have had a number of issues arising from the various presentations. We're going to put some of these issues together and see what we can follow up on. I have listened intently when the chair was speaking. I mean, that recommendation, for instance, that a follow-up study be done for 2021 is very important because, as the chair has noted, most of what we know of these violations has actually taken place in 2021. There is a whole mountain of developments, violations and other developments that have happened around 2021. And those need to be captured for a record, for the record and for other purposes, you know. And now that probably the restrictions are not as tough as they were, they could allow new methodologies of doing the research, and that helps for data, you know, reliable data that can be used in arguments, whether in court or in parliaments, to improve or change the human rights situation. Some of the issues that you yourself raised, Caro and Alfred raised, all these are issues that we're going to look at and see how to incorporate them in the next phase of the work we are going to do. So thank you very much. Constance, will you please share the report on the chat, if you will? Otherwise, you'll find this report. You'll find this report on the website when you visit it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and bye to everyone.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, everyone. Oh, what is that?
Yes, Judge, thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Colette.
Hi, Judge. How are you?
Actually, I'm good.
No, nice to see you.
I liked your comment about whether